Hi friends, in this video we are going to learn 10 more verbs, and with these 10 more verbs we are going to make sentences, and with those sentences we are going to make 48 sentences. So in all you are going to practice about 480 sentences. When you practice 480 sentences, what happens? Of course, your vocal cord opens and the words come out freely from your mouth. So what I want you to do is try to practice as many times as possible. This is what we need to do if we need to learn fluent English. Why? Suppose someone asks you a question, a simple yes or no question. You should be in a position to answer to that question easily, confidently. And at the same time, you should have that confidence to ask someone a question, isn't it? Whether it is a positive question or a negative question, you should be having that much of confidence. That is why I ask you to practice and practice. Practice makes a person perfect. The next verb is drive. Now let's make a sentence out of drive. They drive cars. They don't drive cars. Do they drive cars? Don't they drive cars? They drove cars. They didn't drive cars. Did they drive cars? Didn't they drive cars? They will drive cars. They won't drive cars. Will they drive cars? Won't they drive cars? They are driving cars. They aren't driving cars. Are they driving cars? Aren't they driving cars? They were driving cars. They weren't driving cars. Were they driving cars? Weren't they driving cars? They will be driving cars. They won't be driving cars. Will they be driving cars? Won't they be driving cars? They have driven cars. They haven't driven cars. Have they driven cars? Haven't they driven cars? They had driven cars. They hadn't driven cars. Had they driven cars? Hadn't they driven cars? They will have driven cars. They won't have driven cars. Will they have driven cars? Won't they have driven cars? They have been driving cars. They haven't been driving cars. Have they been driving cars? Haven't they been driving cars? They had been driving cars. They hadn't been driving cars. Had they been driving cars? Hadn't they been driving cars? They will have been driving cars. They won't have been driving cars. Will they have been driving cars? Won't they have been driving cars? Let's go to the next one. What's the next one? It is decide. D-E-C-I-D-E. Decide. Let's make a sentence out of decide. Okay. Parents decide the best. Parents decide the best. Parents don't decide the best. Do parents decide the best? Don't parents decide the best? Parents decided the best. Parents didn't decide the best. Did parents decide the best? Did parents decide the best? Parents will decide the best. Parents won't decide the best. Will parents decide the best? Won't parents decide the best? Parents are deciding the best. Parents aren't deciding the best. Are parents deciding the best? Aren't parents deciding the best? Parents were deciding the best. Parents weren't deciding the best. Were parents deciding the best? Weren't parents deciding the best? Parents will be deciding the best. Parents won't be deciding the best. Will parents be deciding the best? Would parents be deciding the best? Parents have decided the best. Parents haven't decided the best. Will parents have decided the best? Won't parents have decided the best? Parents had decided the best. Parents hadn't decided the best. Had parents decided the best? Hadn't parents decided the best? Parents will have decided the best. Parents won't have decided the best. Will parents have decided the best? Would parents have decided the best? Parents have been deciding the best. Parents haven't been deciding the best. Have parents been deciding the best? Haven't parents been deciding the best? Parents had been deciding the best. Parents hadn't been deciding the best. Had parents been deciding the best? Hadn't parents been deciding the best? Parents will have been deciding the best. Parents won't have been deciding the best. Will parents have been deciding the best? Won't parents have been deciding the best? Now let's go to the next verb. The next verb is defeat. D-E-F-E-A-T. The sentence is, he defeats enemies. He doesn't defeat enemies. Does he defeat enemies? Doesn't he defeat enemies? He defeated enemies. He didn't defeat enemies. Did he defeat enemies? Didn't he defeat enemies? He will defeat enemies. He won't defeat enemies. Will he defeat enemies? Won't he defeat enemies? He is defeating enemies. He isn't defeating enemies. Is he defeating enemies? Isn't he defeating enemies? He was defeating enemies. He wasn't defeating enemies. Was he defeating enemies? Wasn't he defeating enemies? He will be defeating enemies. He won't be defeating enemies. Will he be defeating enemies? Won't he be defeating enemies? He has defeated enemies. He hasn't defeated enemies. Has he defeated enemies? Hasn't he defeated enemies? He had defeated enemies. He hadn't defeated enemies. Had he defeated enemies? Hadn't he defeated enemies? He will have defeated enemies. He won't have defeated enemies. Will he have defeated enemies? Won't he have defeated enemies? He has been defeating enemies. He hasn't been defeating enemies. Has he been defeating enemies? Hasn't he been defeating enemies? He had been defeating enemies. He hadn't been defeating enemies. Had he been defeating enemies? Hadn't he been defeating enemies? He will have been defeating enemies. He won't have been defeating enemies. Will he have been defeating enemies? Won't he have been defeating enemies? Let's go to the next verb. Now the next verb is depend. D-E-P-E-N-D. The sentence is, she depends on parents. She doesn't depend on parents. Does she depend on parents? Doesn't she depend on parents? She depended on parents. She didn't depend on parents. Did she depend on parents? Didn't she depend on parents? She will depend on parents. She won't depend on parents. Will she depend on parents? Won't she depend on parents? She is depending on parents. She isn't depending on parents. Is she depending on parents? Isn't she depending on parents? She was depending on parents. She wasn't depending on parents. Was she depending on parents? Wasn't she depending on parents? She will be depending on parents. She won't be depending on parents. Will she be depending on parents? Won't she be depending on parents? She has depended on parents. She hasn't depended on parents. Has she depended on parents? Hasn't she depended on parents? She had depended on parents. She hadn't depended on parents. Had she depended on parents? Hadn't she depended on parents? She will have depended on parents. She won't have depended on parents. Will she have depended on parents? Won't she have depended on parents? She has been depending on parents. She hasn't been depending on parents. Has she been depending on parents? Hasn't she been depending on parents? She had been depending on parents. She hadn't been depending on parents. Had she been depending on parents? Hadn't she been depending on parents? She will have been depending on parents. She won't have been depending on parents. Friends, you may subscribe to my channel in YouTube. To subscribe, please press here. Follow me on Twitter by clicking here. Want to follow me on Facebook? Click here to like my page.